Some mistakes follow you across years and seas, haunting every quiet moment until you find the courage to face what you've done. For Hroar Ironhand, that moment came in a crowded longhouse where celebration filled the air and a young woman knelt scrubbing floors, invisible to everyone but him. The wedding feast roared around them as warriors drank and laughed, but Hroar's eyes found only Svala, the slave girl whose face had burned itself into his memory 3 years ago. He was the king's most feared warrior. She was a thrall meant to be overlooked. Yet something had brought them together again in this hall, filled with smoke and song. He'd destroyed her world once before with fire and blade. Now he stood at a crossroads between the man he'd been and the man he might become. What happens when a warrior's greatest enemy becomes his only chance at redemption? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The silver arm ring around Hroar's bicep caught the firelight as he stood motionless in the doorway, watching the chaos of celebration unfold before him. The Jarl's gift marked him as one of the king's most trusted shield brothers, a warrior whose name was whispered in both reverence and fear across the northern seas. Tonight, that ring felt heavier than his battle-worn mail shirt. The longhouse of Jarl Magnus stretched before him like a great ship turned upside down, its curved beams rising into shadows thick with smoke from the central hearth. Tapestries depicting great battles hung from the walls, their bright threads telling stories of glory and conquest that once stirred his blood. Now they seemed to mock him with their cheerful violence. Warriors filled the benches along both sides of the hall, their voices rising in boisterous song as they celebrated the union of Erik Magnusson to Astrid Thorsdottir. The bride sat at the high table, her golden hair braided with ribbons, her face flushed with mead and nervous laughter. She was barely 18, younger than some of the raids Hroar had led. The groom, Erik, boasted loudly to his companions about the dowry his new wife would bring: land, silver, and political alliance with her father's powerful clan. Hroar had attended countless such feasts over the years, had toasted many marriages that would bind families and secure peace between feuding lords. He understood the necessity of these unions, the careful balance of power they maintained. What he couldn't understand was why the sight of this particular celebration filled him with such unease. Perhaps it was the memory of distant shores and burning halls that haunted him. 3 years had passed since he'd returned from the great raids across the Western Sea, his ships heavy with treasure and his reputation sealed as one of the finest war leaders of his generation. The king had rewarded him with land, silver, and a place of honor in the royal hall. Yet sleep eluded him most nights, and when it came, it brought dreams of flames and screaming voices that no amount of mead could silence. His gaze drifted across the celebrating crowd until it found her, a young woman kneeling beside the far wall, scrubbing at dark stains on the wooden floor with a coarse brush. Her ash-stained kirtle marked her as a thrall, one of the countless slaves who kept the great households running. Her dark hair was bound back with rough twine, revealing a face that might have been beautiful if not shadowed by exhaustion and careful emptiness. Svala. He'd learned her name from overhearing the other servants, though she spoke little and kept her eyes downcast whenever free men passed near. She moved through her daily tasks like a ghost, present but unseen, useful but unremarkable. The perfect invisible servant that every Jarl prized, one who did her work without complaint and never drew attention to herself. But Hroar saw her, had been seeing her for the 3 days since his arrival at Magnus's hall. Something about the way she carried herself, the careful grace with which she moved despite the heavy burden of her station, stirred a recognition he couldn't quite place. When she turned her head a certain way, when firelight caught her profile, memory tugged at him like a half-remembered song. Around him, the feast continued its ancient rhythm. Serving women hurried between the tables with platters of roasted boar and fresh bread, their faces bright with the reflected warmth of the fires. The ale flowed freely from great wooden casks, and already some of the younger warriors were beginning to sway in their seats. Magnus himself presided from the centre of the high table, his beard streaked with grey but his voice still strong, as he regaled his guests with tales of battles fought alongside Hroar in younger days. "Tell them about the raid on Lindholm," Magnus called across the hall, raising his drinking horn toward Hroar. "Tell them how you held the beach against 30 men while we loaded the ships." The warriors cheered, turning expectant faces toward him. Hroar forced a smile and raised his own horn in acknowledgement, but the words stuck in his throat. Lindholm. He remembered that raid, remembered the monastery walls crumbling under their axes, remembered the monks fleeing into the woods, remembered the weight of silver and gold they'd carried back to their ships. He also remembered the village they'd passed on their way to the coast, the one that had looked prosperous enough to be worth a detour. His eyes found Svala again. She'd paused in her scrubbing, her head tilted slightly, as if listening to Magnus's words. For just a moment, her carefully maintained mask slipped, and Hroar saw something flicker across her features, pain, perhaps, or recognition. Then it was gone, and she bent back to her work with renewed focus. The thralls' quarters where Svala slept were cramped and cold, built into the back of the longhouse where the smoke was thickest and the winter winds found every crack in the timber. She shared the space with a dozen other slaves, men and women taken in raids or born into bondage, all wearing the same expression of resigned endurance. Among them was Runa, an older woman with greying hair and intelligent eyes, who had served Magnus's family since before Eric was born. It was Runa who had taught Svala how to survive in this place, how to make herself useful without becoming a target, how to endure the casual cruelties that were part of a thrall's daily existence. The older woman had been a jarl's daughter once, captured in a raid when she was barely older than Astrid. Time and wisdom had taught her the art of invisibility, the careful balance between civility and dignity that kept a slave alive. "You're troubled tonight," Runa observed as they prepared for sleep, her voice low enough not to wake the others. "More than usual." Svala said nothing, but her hands trembled slightly as she folded her one spare garment. The wedding feast had stirred memories she'd spent 3 years trying to bury. Something about the celebration, about the warriors singing their songs of conquest and glory, had torn at the careful walls she'd built around her past. She'd been Svala Eric's daughter once, daughter of a minor jarl who'd ruled 3 villages along the coast. Her father's hall had been smaller than this one, simpler, but filled with warmth and laughter. She remembered feast days when her mother would braid flowers into her hair, when her younger brother Bjorn would challenge her to races across the meadows behind their home. She remembered feeling safe, cherished, important in the small sphere of her family's world. That world had ended in fire and blood on a spring night, much like this one. Raiders had come in the darkness, striking without warning while the household slept. She'd awakened to smoke and screaming, to the crash of splintering wood and the ring of steel on steel. Her mother had died trying to reach the children's chamber. Her father had fallen defending the main hall. Little Bjorn, she'd never learned what became of Bjorn. She'd been dragged from the burning hall along with the other survivors, valuable prizes to be sold in distant markets. The raiders had been professional, efficient, sorting their captives by age and strength with the casual expertise of men who knew the slave trade well. She'd watched her home burn from the deck of their ship, the flames reflected in the water like fallen stars. The leader of that raid had been a tall man with iron-grey hair and scars marking his weathered face. His name had been spoken in whispers among the captives, Hroar Ironhand, the king's champion, a warrior whose reputation stretched across the northern lands. He'd moved through the aftermath of the battle with the calm authority of a man who'd done such work many times before, inspecting the prisoners and treasure with equal detachment. Their eyes had met once during that long night, when she'd been kneeling among the other captives, waiting to be loaded onto the ships. He'd looked at her for a moment, really looked, not just cataloguing her as merchandise, and something had flickered in his expression. Regret, perhaps, or recognition of her noble bearing, despite her torn clothes and ash-smudged face. Then the moment had passed, and he'd moved on to other matters. She'd been sold in a market town 3 days' sail from her home, purchased by a merchant who specialized in household slaves. Magnus had bought her the following winter, needing servants who could read and write for his growing household. The work wasn't unbearable, scrubbing floors, tending fires, helping in the kitchens, but it was the constant reminder of what she'd lost that ate at her spirit like a slow poison. Now that same warrior sat in Magnus's hall, honored guest at another celebration, probably having forgotten entirely the raid that had destroyed her world. The silver arm ring he wore marked his continued favor with the king, the rewards earned by men who brought wealth home from distant shores. He looked older than she remembered, lines of weariness carved deeper around his eyes, but he was unmistakably the same man who'd commanded the ships that carried her into slavery. The feast was winding toward its close when Gunnar Redbeard caught sight of Svala carrying empty platters toward the kitchen. He was one of Magnus's younger warriors, broad-shouldered and quick-tempered, with an unfortunate tendency to see female thralls as one of the privileges of his position. He'd cornered her before, his hands wandering where they shouldn't, his breath reeking of ale and arrogance. "Svala," he called, loud enough for nearby warriors to hear. "Come, sit with us. The night's still young." She kept her eyes down and tried to pass, but Gunnar's hand shot out to catch her wrist. The platters clattered to the floor, drawing attention from across the hall. Several warriors laughed, enjoying the sport of watching their companion toy with a slave girl. "I have work to finish," she said quietly, trying to pull free without causing a scene. "Work can wait." Gunnar's grip tightened, and his other hand reached for her face. "You're prettier than most thralls. Too good to waste on scrubbing floors." From across the hall, Hroar watched the scene unfold with growing tension. He recognized the casual cruelty in Gunnar's manner, the way the younger warrior assumed his right to take what he wanted. It was behavior he'd seen countless times before, behavior he'd once ignored as simply the way of the world. Tonight, it filled him with unexpected rage. He found himself moving before he'd consciously decided to intervene, crossing the hall with long strides that parted the crowd before him. Warriors stepped aside automatically, recognizing the authority in his bearing, even as they wondered at his destination. "Release her," Hroar said quietly, his voice carrying easily over the noise of the feast. Gunnar looked up, surprise and irritation warring in his expression. "This is no concern of yours, Ironhand. The girl's just a thrall." "Release her," Hroar repeated, and this time there was steel beneath the words. For a moment, the hall grew quiet as warriors sensed the potential for violence. Gunnar was brave enough when facing enemies in battle, but he wasn't fool enough to challenge Hroar Ironhand over a slave girl. His hand dropped away from Svala's wrist, though his face flushed with embarrassment at being publicly corrected. "Of course," Gunnar said with forced lightness. "Just having some sport, no harm intended." Svala gathered the fallen platters with shaking hands, her face carefully blank. But when she straightened, her eyes met Hroar's for just an instant, and he saw something there that made his breath catch in his throat. Recognition, fear, and beneath it all, a flash of the same fire he'd glimpsed 3 years ago in a burning hall. Then she was gone, fleeing toward the kitchens with her burden of dishes, leaving Hroar standing in the middle of the feast with the uncomfortable certainty that his carefully ordered world was about to come apart at the seams. The clay drinking horn shattered against the stone floor of the kitchen, its pieces scattering like her composure. Svala stared down at the broken fragments, her hands trembling as the reality of what had just happened crashed over her like a cold wave. He was here. The man who had destroyed everything she'd ever loved sat in Magnus's hall, honored and celebrated, while she scrubbed the floors beneath his feet. For 3 years she'd lived with the memory of that scarred face, those cold grey eyes that had looked upon her burning home with such terrible indifference. Now fate had brought them together again, and she felt the careful walls she'd built around her pain beginning to crumble. "Child, what's wrong?" Runa appeared at her side, concern etched in her weathered features. The older woman had followed her from the hall, sensing distress in Svala's hasty retreat. Svala's voice broke. She couldn't find words for the storm of emotion churning in her chest. Rage, terror, and something else she couldn't name, all fought for dominance in her mind. Runa knelt beside her, helping gather the broken pottery. "Tell me." The warrior, Hroar Ironhand. The name tasted like ash in her mouth. He was the one who led the raid on my father's hall. Runa's hands stilled. She'd heard pieces of Svala's story over the years, enough to understand the depth of trauma that the girl carried. But to have the architect of that destruction appear as an honored guest, it was cruel beyond measure. "Are you certain?" Svala closed her eyes, and she was back on that terrible night. I could never forget his face. He stood on the deck of his ship and watched our hall burn. I was kneeling with the other prisoners, and he looked at me. Just for a moment, but I saw him clearly in the firelight. "Child, you're shaking." "He doesn't remember me. I could see it in his eyes tonight. What destroyed my entire world was just another raid to him. Just another successful expedition to add to his reputation." Runa's arms encircled her, and for a moment Svala allowed herself to lean into that maternal comfort. The older woman had become something of a mother to her during these years of captivity, offering wisdom and protection when she could. "What will you do?" "I don't know." Svala pulled back, wiping tears she hadn't realized were falling. "What can I do? He's the king's champion, and I'm a thrall. If I accused him, who would believe me? And even if they did, what crime is it for a warrior to raid enemy settlements? It's what warriors do." Before Runa could respond, footsteps echoed in the corridor leading to the kitchens. Both women looked up to see Hroar himself approaching, his tall frame filling the doorway. His face was troubled, and he moved with the careful deliberation of a man trying to appear less threatening than his reputation suggested. "I came to," he began, then stopped as he took in the scene before him. Svala's tear-stained face, the broken pottery, the protective way Runa positioned herself between them. Understanding dawned slowly in his eyes, followed by something that might have been horror. "You," his voice was barely a whisper, "gods above, you're her." "The girl from Eriksholm," Svala said, rising to her feet with as much dignity as she could muster. "My father was Jarl Erik the Bold. You killed him." Hroar's face went white. He took a step backward as if she'd struck him. "Erik's daughter. You're Erik's daughter. But that's impossible," the reports said. "The reports said what? That there were no survivors?" Bitter laughter escaped her throat. "There were survivors, Hroar Ironhand. Women and children dragged from their beds to be sold in distant markets. Did you think your victories came without cost to the conquered?" We didn't." He struggled for words, his composure cracking. "I thought the family had been killed in the fighting. I was told there were no noble captives taken. Then you were lied to, or you chose not to look too closely at the cargo your ships carried home." Svala's voice grew stronger as anger replaced fear. "I was there, warrior. I watched you inspect your prizes. I was kneeling 10 feet from where you stood." The memory hit Hroar like a physical blow. He did remember a young woman among the captives, her bearing too proud for her circumstances, her eyes blazing with defiance despite her tears. He'd noticed her because she'd seemed different from the usual peasant prisoners they took. But he'd been focused on other matters, on organizing the retreat and counting the treasure. He'd delegated the handling of captives to his lieutenants, trusting them to sort through the human cargo according to established protocols. "I remember you," he said quietly. I should have asked about your family, should have ensured. You should have left us in peace." The words exploded from her with 3 years of pent-up grief and rage. "You should have chosen some other hall to burn, some other family to destroy. My mother died trying to reach us. My little brother, her voice broke. "I don't even know what happened to Bjorn. He was only 8 years old." Hroar felt as if the ground were shifting beneath his feet. The successful raid he'd been praised for, the expedition that had earned him royal favor and filled the king's treasury, it had a human cost he'd never bothered to calculate. Standing before him was the living proof of his willful blindness, the consequence of his choice to see captives as cargo rather than people. "Your brother," he said, his voice hoarse. "Small boy, dark hair." Svala's eyes went wide. "You remember him? He was taken with the others. One of my men, Olaf the Stout, he had no sons of his own. He took the boy to raise as his thrall." Hroar's memory was returning in painful fragments. "The boy was brave. Tried to protect you during the loading of the ships. Is he alive?" The question came out as barely a whisper. "I don't know. Olaf returned to his farm in the east after that season. I haven't seen him since." Hope and despair warred in Svala's expression. To learn that Bjorn might still live was a gift beyond measure, but to know he was enslaved, growing up in bondage, because of decisions made by the man standing before her, it was almost too much to bear. "Why are you here?" she asked finally. "Why did you come to the kitchens?" Hroar looked down at his hands, noting absently how they trembled. These were hands that had wielded sword and axe with deadly precision, that had commanded ships and men across the northern seas. Now they shook like those of an old man. "I came to apologize for what happened in the hall. Gunnar's behavior toward you." He looked up, meeting her eyes with visible effort. "I had no right to intervene. You're not my responsibility, and I may have made things worse for you. You protected me from one of your own kind. Why? I don't know." The honesty in his admission surprised them both. "Something about seeing him force himself on you, it felt wrong. It reminded me of—" He stopped, unable to finish. "Of other times you've seen such things and done nothing?" "Yes." The simple admission hung between them like a sword. Svala studied his face, searching for deception or manipulation. Instead, she saw something she hadn't expected: genuine remorse. Not the calculated regret of a man caught in wrongdoing, but the deep, bone-deep anguish of someone confronting the true cost of his actions for the first time. "What do you want from me?" she asked. "Nothing," Hroar said quickly. "I want nothing from you. I needed you to know that I remember now. I remember your family, your hall, your brother. It wasn't just another raid to me. Not anymore. But it was then. Yes, it was." He met her gaze directly, not trying to excuse or justify. "I was proud of that expedition, proud of how cleanly it was executed, how little resistance we encountered, how much wealth we brought home. I never thought about the families destroyed or the lives ruined. I told myself it was simply war, simply the way of the world. And now I can't sleep without seeing burning halls. I can't look at my silver and gold without wondering whose blood paid for it, and I can't see you scrubbing floors in a thrall's kirtle without knowing that I put you there." Runa had remained silent during this exchange, but now she stepped forward. "What will you do with this knowledge, warrior?" Hroar looked between the two women, seeing in their faces the weight of suffering he'd helped create. The comfortable certainties that had guided his life were crumbling, replaced by questions he didn't know how to answer. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I'll find a way to make it right. Somehow." Svala laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Make it right? Can you bring back my parents? Can you restore my brother's freedom? Can you give me back the life I was meant to have?" "No, but I can." "You can do nothing," she said firmly. "Nothing that matters. The damage is done, and no amount of guilt or good intentions can undo it." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving Hroar standing among the broken pieces of the clay horn, finally understanding that some things, once shattered, could never truly be made whole again. The carved wooden bird sat in Svala's palm like a fragment of her lost childhood. Its tiny wings, worn smooth by years of handling, bore the marks of her father's careful knife work. He'd made it for her 7th birthday, whittling away at the oak during long winter evenings while her mother spun wool and told stories of the old gods. She'd hidden it beneath her sleeping furs when the raiders came, clutching it against her chest as flames devoured everything else she'd ever loved. Somehow, miraculously, it had survived the chaos and journey that followed. Now it was her only tangible link to the girl she'd been before the world turned to ash. "You didn't sleep," Runa observed, settling beside her on the low bench outside the thrall quarters. Dawn was breaking over Magnus's compound, painting the timber buildings in shades of gold and amber. "I kept thinking about what he said, about Bjorn." Svala turned the little bird over in her hands. "For 3 years I've pictured him dead. It was easier than imagining him alive and suffering. Now I don't know which is worse, mourning him or hoping for him." The older woman's weathered hand covered hers. "Hope is a dangerous gift, child, but it's still a gift." They sat in comfortable silence as the settlement came to life around them. Servants emerged from their quarters to begin the day's work, their breath visible in the cool morning air. From the main hall came the sounds of warriors stirring, nursing sore heads from the previous night's celebrations. "He'll try to speak with you again," Runa said eventually. "I know. What will you tell him?" Svala closed her fingers around the wooden bird. "What can I tell him? That his guilt changes nothing? That knowing the truth about what he did to my family doesn't make me feel better, it makes me feel worse?" Before Runa could respond, a commotion erupted from the direction of the stables. Raised voices carried across the yard, and both women looked up to see Gunnar Redbeard gesticulating angrily at a group of younger warriors. His face was flushed with more than morning cold, and his words were slurred enough to suggest he'd been drinking since before dawn. "Tell you something's not right about Ironhand," he was saying as they drew closer. "Did you see how he defended that thrall last night? What kind of warrior intervenes over a slave girl?" "Careful, Gunnar," warned Thorolf, one of Magnus's more level-headed men. "You're talking about the king's champion." "The king's champion who's gone soft," Gunnar spat. 3 years ago he could cut down 10 men without breaking stride. Now he can't even watch a bit of sport with a thrall without getting his hackles up. Mark my words, something's changed in him." Svala felt her stomach clench. The way suspicion could spread among warriors like rot in timber. If Gunnar continued this line of talk, it could bring trouble for everyone herself, Hroar, and anyone caught between them. "Maybe he just has better things to do than watch you paw at servants," suggested another warrior, earning snickers from his companions. Gunnar's face darkened. "You think this is funny? A man's reputation is built over years and can be destroyed in moments. If Ironhand has lost his edge, if he's become weak, if you have concerns about my edge," a new voice interrupted, "perhaps you'd like to test it personally." Every head turned to see Hroar approaching from the main hall. He moved with the fluid grace of a born fighter, his hand resting casually on his sword hilt. There was nothing overtly threatening in his posture, but something in his eyes made the younger warriors step back instinctively. Gunnar straightened, trying to salvage his dignity. "About what exactly?" Hroar's voice remained calm, almost conversational. "About my ability to lead men? My loyalty to the king? Or perhaps you're questioning my judgment in general?" The challenge hung in the air like the scent of an approaching storm. Gunnar was brave enough in battle, but he wasn't foolish enough to push this confrontation further. Not here, not now, with Magnus's other warriors watching and judging. "Of course not," Gunnar said finally. "Just making conversation." "Good." Hroar's smile was winter cold. "Because if you were questioning my judgment, I might feel compelled to demonstrate exactly how sharp my edge remains. For educational purposes, you understand." The group dispersed quickly after that, leaving Hroar standing alone in the yard. His gaze found Svala across the compound, and for a moment their eyes met. She saw exhaustion in his face, the kind of bone-deep weariness that came from sleepless nights and troubled thoughts. Then Magnus emerged from the hall, calling for his guest, and the moment passed. The day's work began, as it always did, with a litany of tasks that needed completion before the evening meal. Svala threw herself into the familiar routine, grateful for the distraction. She helped prepare breakfast for the household, hauled water from the well, and swept the hall clean of the previous night's debris. It was while scrubbing the hearthstones that she became aware of being watched. She looked up to find Astrid, Magnus's new daughter by marriage, standing nearby with an expression of curious sympathy. "You're the one Gunnar was bothering last night," the young woman said. "It wasn't a question." "Yes, my lady." Astrid was barely 18, with the kind of fresh beauty that attracted poets and admirers. But there was intelligence in her blue eyes, and her marriage to Eric had already shown her something about the casual cruelties that powerful men could inflict. "I'm sorry for his behavior. Not all warriors are like that." "No, my lady. Some are worse." The blunt honesty seemed to startle Astrid. She studied Svala's face with new interest. "You speak like someone who's seen more of the world than most thralls." "I have seen enough." "Were you born to bondage?" "No." Svala returned to her work, hoping the conversation would end there. But Astrid settled on a nearby bench, apparently in no hurry to leave. "I was lucky," the young woman continued. "My father chose my husband well. Eric is kind to me, treats me with respect, but I know that's not always the case. I've heard stories of wives who are little better than expensive thralls." Despite herself, Svala found her interest piqued. It was rare for a noble woman to speak so candidly about such things. "Marriage can be another form of captivity," Svala agreed carefully. "Exactly." Astrid leaned forward. "That's why I noticed what happened last night. Hroar Ironhand could have ignored Gunnar's behavior, most men would have. But he chose to intervene. Why do you think that was?" The question hit closer to the mark than Astrid could possibly know. Svala kept her expression neutral. "I cannot guess at a warrior's motivations, my lady. Can't you, or won't you?" Before Svala could answer, Eric appeared in the doorway, calling for his wife. Astrid rose gracefully, but she paused before leaving. "If you ever need to talk," she said quietly, "about anything at all, I'm willing to listen." Alone again, Svala tried to focus on her work, but her mind kept returning to that moment of unexpected kindness. Perhaps not all of her captors were cut from the same cloth. Perhaps, in this place, where power meant everything, there might still be room for compassion. The thought both comforted and terrified her. Hope, as Runa had said, was indeed a dangerous gift. The iron thrall collar felt heavier around Svala's neck as she knelt by the stream behind Magnus's hall, washing linens in the cold morning water. The metal band was a constant reminder of her status, its weight both physical and symbolic. She'd grown so accustomed to it that she barely noticed it anymore, except in dreams, where she sometimes still had the smooth throat of a free woman. Hroar's dreams had grown worse since their confrontation in the kitchen. Night after night, he found himself back on the burning deck of his longship, watching Eriksholm's hall collapse into flames. But now the faceless victims had names, faces, stories. The young woman kneeling among the captives wasn't just another prize of war, she was Eric's daughter, brave and noble even in defeat. He'd taken to walking the compound's perimeter each dawn, unable to sleep past the earliest light. The exercise helped clear his head, or so he told himself. In truth, these walks often brought him past the stream where the thralls did their washing, and he found his steps slowing whenever he caught sight of a familiar figure working by the water's edge. This morning was no different. He approached slowly, making enough noise to announce his presence without startling her. Svala looked up briefly, then returned to her work without acknowledgement. Her movements were efficient, practiced the kind of economy that came from years of unforgiving routine. "I've been thinking about what you said," he began. settling on a fallen log several paces away, close enough to speak quietly, far enough to avoid seeming threatening. "About there being nothing I can do to make things right." She didn't respond, but her hands stilled for a moment in the cold water. "You were correct, of course. I can't undo the past. But I've been wondering what if there was something I could do about the present." Now she did look up, wariness clear in her expression. "Such as? Your brother, Bjorn. I could send men to find him, to learn what became of him." The wet linen slipped from her fingers. For a heartbeat, hope blazed in her eyes, before suspicion quickly smothered it. "Why would you do that?" "Because you deserve to know, because he deserves better than slavery if he still lives. And what would you want in return?" The question struck him like a physical blow. "Nothing. I would want nothing in return." "Everyone wants something, Hroar Ironhand, especially men like you." The judgment in her voice was worse than any sword thrust. "Men like you," as if she could see through to the core of him, to all the selfish calculations that had guided his life until now. "Perhaps you're right," he said quietly. "Perhaps I do want something. Perhaps I want to sleep without seeing burning halls. Perhaps I want to look at myself in polished bronze without feeling sick. Perhaps I want to believe that a man can change, that past sins don't have to define his future forever." Svala studied his face for a long moment. The morning light revealed details she hadn't noticed before: the lines of exhaustion around his eyes, the way his hands trembled slightly when he thought no one was watching. This wasn't the confident conqueror from her nightmares. This was a man coming apart at the seams. "You really can't sleep." "Not for weeks. Not since I arrived here and saw you." "Good." The word came out harsher than she'd intended, but she didn't take it back. Let him suffer as she had suffered. Let him know what it felt like to be haunted. But even as she spoke, she felt a strange stirring of something that might have been pity. Not forgiveness, that was still far beyond her reach, but recognition of shared pain. Before either could speak again, footsteps crunched on the gravel path behind them. Gunnar emerged from the tree line, his expression darkening as he took in the scene before him. "Well, well," he said with mock joviality, "what have we here? The great Ironhand, keeping company with thralls by the stream. How the mighty have fallen." Hroar rose slowly, his hand moving to his sword hilt. "Gunnar, you're up early." "Couldn't sleep. Strange dreams. You know how it is." Gunnar's gaze shifted to Svala, who had resumed her washing with studied intensity. "Though I see you've found your own remedy for sleeplessness. Tell me, does conversation with slaves really calm a warrior's troubled mind?" "Careful," Hroar warned, but Gunnar was already moving closer. "Or perhaps it's more than conversation you're after. I can understand the appeal. She's prettier than most thralls, and they say noble blood runs differently than common stock." The insult hung in the morning air like the scent of approaching violence. Svala felt her face burn with shame and anger, but she kept her eyes fixed on the linens in her hands. To react would only make things worse. Hroar's sword was half drawn before he caught himself. The gesture wasn't lost on Gunnar, who smiled with ugly satisfaction. "Striking, isn't it?" Gunnar continued. "How quickly a man's priorities can shift. I wonder what Magnus would think of his honoured guest's new interests, or the king for that matter." "I think," Hroar said with dangerous quiet, "that you should mind your own affairs and leave this place. Now." "Oh, I'll leave, but I think I'll take the thrall with me. Someone needs to finish her washing, and I could use the company." Gunnar reached for Svala's arm, and this time Hroar's blade cleared its sheath completely. The ring of steel broke the morning stillness like a thunderclap. "Touch her and die." The words were spoken so simply, with such absolute certainty, that even Gunnar's bravado faltered. He found himself looking into the eyes of the man who'd earned his reputation in blood and iron, and suddenly remembered why that reputation was so feared. "You draw steel on a fellow warrior over a slave?" But the bluster was hollow now. "I draw steel on a dog who forces himself on unwilling women. The fact that you're technically a warrior is merely unfortunate. For a moment, violence trembled in the air between them. Then wisdom overcame Gunnar's pride, and he stepped back with his hands raised in mock surrender. "Peace, Ironhand. I meant no real harm, just testing your resolve. Consider it tested. Now leave." Gunnar retreated, but his parting words carried the weight of a promise. "This isn't finished, Ironhand. Magnus will hear of this. The king will hear of this. You can't protect her forever." When the younger warrior had gone, Hroar sheathed his sword with hands that shook slightly. The confrontation had crystallized something he'd been trying to deny. He was willing to fight for this woman, perhaps even to die for her, and he didn't entirely understand why. Svala had watched the entire exchange in silence, her face pale but composed. Now she spoke quietly, without looking up from her work. "You shouldn't have done that. He was going to hurt you, and now he'll find other ways. Worse ways. You've made an enemy of him, and enemies like Gunnar are dangerous to everyone around them. I couldn't just stand there and watch." "Why not?" She finally looked at him directly, her eyes blazing with sudden anger. "You've watched before. You've done worse than what you've participated. What makes this different?" The question struck at the heart of his confusion, his growing certainty that something fundamental had changed in him since that night in the kitchen. "I don't know," he admitted, "but it is different. You are different. I'm the same person I was 3 years ago when you loaded me onto your ship like cargo. No, you're not, and neither am I." The truth of those words hung between them like a bridge neither was quite ready to cross. Hroar's father's war axe hung on the wall of his guest chamber, its blade still bearing the nicks and scratches of countless battles. The weapon had made him famous across the northern lands. Death's Edge, they'd called it, for its ability to cleave through shield and bone with equal ease. Now it felt like an accusation, its weight a constant reminder of the man he'd been. He sat on the edge of his bed in the pre-dawn darkness, staring at the axe while memories churned in his mind like a restless sea. How many men had fallen to that blade? How many halls had burned in his wake? The numbers were too great to count, the faces too numerous to remember, except now one face refused to leave him in peace. The sound of footsteps in the corridor outside his chamber made him look up. Soft, careful steps that could only belong to a servant trying not to wake the household. Without fully understanding why, he found himself moving to the door, easing it open just enough to peer into the hallway. Svala moved like a ghost through the shadows, carrying a bucket of ash from the cold hearths to dispose of outside. Her movements were graceful despite the burden, and something about the way she held herself proud even in servitude stirred that same recognition he'd felt 3 years ago. Before he could think better of it, he stepped into the hallway. She froze at the sight of him, her knuckles white where they gripped the bucket's handle. For a moment they simply stood there in the flickering candlelight, warrior and thrall, destroyer and victim, 2 souls bound together by tragedy and circumstance. "I couldn't sleep," he said quietly. "Nor could I." "The dreams?" She nodded, not trusting her voice. The nightmares had been worse since their conversation by the stream, as if speaking the truth aloud had given new power to old memories. "Would you—" He stopped, uncertain how to phrase what he wanted to ask. "Would you walk with me? Outside? The morning air might help us both." Every instinct she possessed screamed against trusting him, against being alone with the man who'd destroyed her world. But exhaustion and loneliness wore at her defenses, and something in his voice, a vulnerability she'd never expected to hear from a legendary warrior, made her nod reluctantly. They walked in silence through Magnus's compound, and out toward the meadows beyond, their breath visible in the cold air. The sky was beginning to lighten in the east, painting the landscape in shades of grey and silver. "Tell me about them," Hroar said finally as they settled on a fallen log overlooking the valley below. "Your family, your real family, not the fragments I remember from that night." "Why?" The question held no hostility now, only weary curiosity. Because I need to know what I destroyed. I need to understand who they were before that night. Svala was quiet for so long he thought she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was distant, as if she were seeing ghosts in the morning mist. My father was a good man, not the strongest Jarl, not the richest, but fair to his people. He'd sit in judgment over disputes with infinite patience, always trying to find solutions that left both parties with their dignity intact. A small smile touched her lips. He used to say that a wise leader builds bridges while a fool builds walls. And your mother? Beautiful, kind. She could sing in a way that made strong men weep. The smile faded. She died trying to reach us when the attack began. A spear took her in the back as she ran across the courtyard. Hroar closed his eyes, seeing that night with terrible new clarity. He remembered the woman who'd fallen in the central yard, remembered stepping over her body as he pressed forward toward the hall's main doors. She'd just been an obstacle then, a casualty of war. Now she had a name, a daughter who'd loved her, a husband who'd mourned her. Bjorn was 8, Svala continued, her voice growing softer. Brave beyond his years, always trying to protect me even though I was older and bigger. He loved stories about heroes and dragons, used to act them out with wooden swords father carved for him. Her fingers found the small wooden bird in her pocket, tracing its familiar contours. The last thing I heard him say was a promise that he'd find me somehow, that he'd rescue me from whoever took me away. Gods, Hroar whispered. The weight of what he'd done pressed down on him like a mountain, threatening to crush what remained of his spirit. How do you bear it? How do you get up each morning knowing what was stolen from you? Because the alternative is to lie down and die, and that would make their deaths meaningless. She looked at him directly, her eyes bright with unshed tears. You want to know what keeps me alive, Hroar Ironhand? It's the hope that someday their murderer will face justice, that someday the man who destroyed everything I loved will understand the weight of what he's done. I understand it now. Do you? Because understanding and feeling are different things. When you close your eyes, do you see my mother's face as she fell? Do you hear Bjorn's voice calling for his sister? Do you feel the heat of our hall burning and know that you're the one who lit the flames? Yes. The admission came out as barely a whisper. Yes, to all of it. Every night. They sat in silence as the sun crested the hills, painting the world in shades of gold and amber. Somewhere in the distance, a bird sang its morning song, oblivious to the human suffering being laid bare in this quiet meadow. I want to make amends, Hroar said finally. Not because I expect forgiveness. I know that's beyond hope now, but because it's the right thing to do. Tell me how. I don't know if amends are possible. Some wounds cut too deep to heal. But if they were possible, if there were a way to balance the scales somehow? Svala was quiet for a long moment, watching the play of sunlight across the valley below. When she spoke, her voice held a note of desperate longing. Find my brother. If he lives, free him. Give him the chance to become the man our father raised him to be. And if he's dead, then honor his memory by becoming better than the man who killed him. Hroar felt something shift inside his chest, as if a door that had been locked for years was finally beginning to open. I'll send men east immediately. They'll search every farm, every settlement in Olaf's territory until they find word of your brother. And if Magnus questions your orders, if he asks why you're sending warriors on such a mission, I'll tell him it's a matter of honor, a debt that needs settling. Is that what this is? A matter of honor? He looked at her then. Really looked, seeing not the thrall with ash-stained clothes, but the Jarl's daughter with fire in her eyes, the woman whose courage had impressed him even in the midst of conquest and destruction. No, he said quietly, it's something much more dangerous than honor. The words hung between them like a confession, carrying implications neither was ready to examine too closely. But as they walked back toward the settlement in comfortable silence, something had changed. The wall between destroyer and victim had developed its first crack, and through that crack, possibility was beginning to seep like the first light of dawn. The embroidered hair ribbon was faded now, its once bright threads dulled by years of careful hiding and secret treasuring. Svala held it between her fingers as she sat in the small alcove behind the kitchens where the servants took their brief respites. The delicate needlework had been her mother's tiny flowers and vines, worked in silver thread that had once caught the light like captured stars. Her mother had woven it into her hair on her 16th birthday, the last celebration they'd shared before the world turned to ash and blood. Every Jarl's daughter should have something beautiful that's hers alone, Sigrid had said, her gentle hands working the ribbon through Svala's dark braids. Something that speaks of who she truly is, beneath all the roles and duties the world places upon her. Now it was all she had left of that identity. Svala Eriksdottir, beloved daughter, cherished sister, heir to 3 prosperous villages. The woman who wore iron collars and scrubbed floors was someone else entirely, a creature of necessity, born from the ashes of the girl she'd been. "You're troubled again," Runa observed, settling beside her with the quiet grace of advancing years. "More than usual, if that's possible." "He's been sending riders east," Svala said without preamble. "Hroar, looking for news of Bjorn." "I know. The whole settlement knows. Magnus has been asking questions." Svala's stomach clenched. "What kind of questions?" "The kind that suggest he's growing suspicious of his honored guest's recent preoccupations. Gunnar has been filling his ear with poison, suggesting that Ironhand's famous edge has been dulled by, how did he put it, unnatural sympathies. This is what I was afraid of. His protection is making everything worse." "Is it protection, or is it something else?" The question hung between them like smoke from a dying fire. Svala knew what Runa was suggesting, had felt the dangerous current of understanding that flowed between herself and Hroar during their dawn conversation. It would have been simpler if she could hate him cleanly, completely, without the complications that came with seeing him as more than just the destroyer of her world. "It doesn't matter what it is," she said finally. "He's still the man who led the raid that killed my parents. He's still the reason I wear this collar instead of a crown. And yet you've begun to see him differently. I've begun to see that he's capable of remorse. That doesn't erase what he did." Before Runa could respond, footsteps echoed in the corridor beyond their alcove. Astrid appeared in the doorway, her young face bright with purpose and curiosity. "Svala, I've been looking for you. I wanted to." She stopped, taking in the ribbon in Svala's hands. "Oh, that's beautiful. Did you make it?" "My mother did." The words slipped out before Svala could consider the wisdom of such honesty. Astrid's expression grew more intent. "Your mother was skilled with needlework. This is noble quality, the kind of work done in Jarl's halls." She paused, studying Svala's face with new understanding. "You weren't born a thrall, were you?" Runa started to speak, probably to deflect the dangerous line of questioning, but Svala held up a hand to stop her. Something about Astrid's directness, her lack of artifice, made deception feel both impossible and unnecessary. "No, I was born free." "What happened?" "Raiders. 3 years ago, they burned my father's hall and took everyone they could sell." Astrid's face paled. "Gods above. I'm sorry. I had no idea that—" She stopped, her quick mind making connections. 3 years ago. That would have been during the great raids across the Western Sea. The ones that made Hroar Ironhand famous. Silence stretched between the 3 women like a drawn bowstring. Svala said nothing, but her expression was answer enough. "He was there," Astrid whispered. "He was part of the raid that destroyed your family. He led it." The young woman's face went through a series of expressions: shock, understanding, and finally something that might have been admiration. "And yet you haven't tried to kill him. You haven't accused him publicly or demanded justice from Magnus." "What justice could I demand? I'm a thrall. He's the king's champion. Who would believe my word against his? And even if they did, what crime would they name? Warriors raid. It's what they do. The fact that my family suffered doesn't make his actions illegal, but it makes them personal. Yes. Astrid settled on the bench across from them, her wedding finery a stark contrast to the rough surroundings. Is that why he's been acting so strangely? Why Gunnar keeps muttering about changes in him? I think, Runa said carefully, that sometimes a man can carry out necessary actions without truly understanding their cost. And sometimes, when understanding finally comes, it changes everything. He's trying to make amends, Svala added, her voice barely audible. Looking for my brother, offering protection, as if guilt could balance the scales of what was taken. Can't it? Astrid asked. I mean, not completely, but isn't the attempt worth something? The question struck at the heart of Svala's confusion. In the long, sleepless hours since their conversation by the stream, she'd found herself watching Hroar with new eyes. She saw how he flinched when servants hurried to obey his commands, how he insisted on serving himself rather than allowing thralls to wait on him. She noticed the way he moved through Magnus's hall, like a man walking through a graveyard, seeing ghosts where others saw only celebration. I don't know, she admitted. I want to hate him. It would be so much simpler if I could just hate him completely. But when I see how this knowledge is tearing him apart, when I watch him struggle with what he's done, I feel something I didn't expect. What? Pity, and that terrifies me more than hatred ever did. Astrid leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper. What if it's more than pity? That's impossible. Is it? You're both trapped in different ways, both prisoners of what happened that night. Maybe finding a way forward means finding it together. He destroyed my world, and now he's destroying himself with guilt over it. Maybe that's a kind of justice. Before Svala could respond to that disturbing thought, the sound of raised voices carried from the main hall. All three women exchanged worried glances. Arguments in a Jarl's hall rarely ended well for anyone, especially servants who might be caught in the crossfire. They emerged from their alcove to find Magnus pacing in the center of his hall, while Hroar stood motionless before the high table. Gunnar lurked nearby with the satisfied expression of a man who'd finally landed a telling blow. Cannot continue, Magnus was saying, his voice tight with frustration. You are my honored guest, champion of our king, and I will not have you diminished by whispered rumors and speculation. What rumors? Hroar's voice was dangerously quiet. That you've gone soft. That you spend your mornings talking with thralls instead of training with warriors. That you've forgotten your place and your purpose. And what do you believe my purpose to be? To serve the king with strength and clarity, to inspire other warriors through your example, to be the legend they sing about in halls across the north. Magnus gestured broadly. Instead, you brood like a lovesick boy and waste men on fool's errands, searching for some slave child who's probably been dead for years. Svala felt the blood drain from her face. Magnus knew about the search for Bjorn. Worse, he was dismissing her brother as worthless, as not even worthy of concern. That child, Hroar said with careful control, is important to me. Why? What could a thrall boy possibly matter to Hroar Ironhand? The question hung in the air like the scent of approaching storm. From where she stood in the shadows, Svala could see the moment when Hroar made his choice, the moment when he decided that some truths were worth the price of speaking them. Because, he said quietly, I am the one who enslaved him. The royal summons scroll arrived at dawn, its wax seal bearing the mark of the king himself. Magnus broke it open with trembling fingers, his face growing pale as he read the contents. The thick parchment seemed to burn in his hands. As understanding dawned, this was no ordinary communication from the crown. Hroar, Magnus called, his voice tight with barely controlled tension. You need to see this. Now. Hroar entered the hall, still wearing his practice clothes, sweat from the morning's training session dampening his hair. He'd been working with sword and axe since before sunrise, trying to exhaust himself enough that sleep might come without dreams. The sight of Magnus's expression killed any hope of a peaceful day. "The king summons you," Magnus said without preamble, holding out the scroll. "There's to be a new expedition, a significant one, by the look of it." Hroar took the parchment, his eyes scanning the formal script with growing unease. The words seemed to dance before his vision as their meaning became clear. A raid was being planned, not just any raid, but one targeting the coastal settlements to the east, the very territories where his men had been searching for word of Bjorn. "When?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. "The fleet assembles in 2 weeks. You're to lead the land forces while Jarl Thorson commands the ships." Magnus studied Hroar's face intently. "This is a great honor. The king specifically requested you by name." Hroar continued reading, and with each line the trap became more apparent. The target wasn't random intelligence had identified a prosperous settlement called Raven Shollow, known for its silver mines and timber trade. More importantly, it was rumored to harbor refugees from previous raids, people who'd fled their destroyed homes and built new lives in what they thought was safety. His blood turned to ice as he reached the final paragraph. Specific orders regarding the treatment of captives, the division of spoils, and the handling of any who might pose future threats. Between the formal language, a clear message emerged. This wasn't just about wealth. This was about eliminating loose ends, silencing voices that might speak against the crown's expanding power. "There's more," Magnus said quietly. "A private message, for your eyes alone." He handed over a smaller scroll, this one sealed with black wax. Hroar broke it open with hands that had begun to shake despite his efforts at control. The message was brief and devastatingly clear. "Recent reports suggest you've lost focus on your duties. This expedition will serve as demonstration of your continued loyalty and effectiveness. Failure to complete your mission with your customary efficiency will be seen as evidence that your time as our champion has passed. Hrothgar Rex." Beneath the formal signature was a single line in different handwriting. "Your thrall loving has been noted. Correct this weakness or face the consequences." "Bad news?" Magnus asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. Hroar crumpled the private message, his mind racing through the implications. Someone had been reporting on his behavior, his conversations with Svala, his orders to search for Bjorn. The king now saw him as potentially unreliable, and this raid was both test and punishment. "I need to prepare," he said tersely. "Send word to my captains. We leave in 3 days. 3 days? But the summons says—" "I know what it says. But I have matters to settle here first." As Magnus hurried away to carry out his orders, Hroar remained in the hall, staring down at the royal scroll. The trap was perfectly constructed. Refuse the mission and be branded a traitor, complete it and destroy any chance of finding Bjorn alive. Worse, if the boy was indeed in Raven's Hollow as a refugee, Hroar would be ordered to kill or recapture the very person he'd promised to free. The sound of soft footsteps made him look up. Svala entered the hall, carrying fresh rushes for the floors, but she stopped when she saw his expression. "What is it?" she asked, setting down her burden. He held out the summons without speaking. She took it hesitantly, her reading skills allowing her to parse the formal language despite her years of servitude. As understanding dawned, her face went white as fresh snow. "Raven Shollow," she whispered. "They're sending you to Raven Shollow. You know the place. My uncle, my father's brother, Einar. When word reached the neighboring settlements about our hall's destruction, he sent boats to search for survivors. They found some people who'd escaped into the woods during the attack." Her voice grew stronger with desperate hope. "If Bjorn survived, if he somehow got away, he would have gone there." "To your uncle." "Known." "Yes." Tears began to flow down her cheeks as the full horror of the situation became clear. "You're being sent to destroy the last of my family." Again, Hroar felt the world tilt around him as the king's true purpose became apparent. This wasn't just about testing his loyalty, it was about completing the job that should have been finished 3 years ago. Einar's settlement had grown too prosperous, too welcoming to refugees who might carry inconvenient stories about royal raids. The crown wanted it silenced permanently. "I won't do it," he said quietly. "You have to. You're the king's champion. If I refuse, I'll be branded an outlaw and hunted down like a mad dog. My lands will be forfeit, my men scattered or executed as traitors. And if I obey, I'll complete the destruction of your family and murder any chance you have of finding peace." They stood in silence, the weight of impossible choices pressing down on them like a physical thing. Outside, the sounds of daily life continued, servants going about their tasks, warriors preparing for the day's training, the ordinary rhythms of a great household. But inside the hall, 2 people faced a crisis that would define the rest of their lives. "There's a third option," Svala said finally, her voice barely audible. "What?" "Warn them. Send a messenger ahead to tell my uncle what's coming. Let them flee before your ships arrive. And when I reach an empty settlement, when I return to the king with no captives, no treasure, no proof of victory, tell them the intelligence was wrong, that the settlement was already abandoned when you arrived." Hroar shook his head slowly. He'd never believe that. Too convenient, too neat, and there would be other raids, other commanders sent to finish what I failed to do. "Then what do you suggest?" The question hung between them like a blade balanced on its edge. Hroar looked at this woman whose life he'd shattered, whose family he'd destroyed, whose brother he'd promised to find and free. The irony was bitter beyond words. The king's trap had shown him exactly where Bjorn likely was, but only by sending him to destroy the boy all over again. "I could defect," he said quietly, "abandon my oaths, renounce my loyalty to the crown, take ship and sail west to lands where the king's reach doesn't extend. Alone? Not alone." He met her eyes directly, seeing the question there and answering it with quiet certainty. "With you, if you're willing." The offer stunned her into silence. To flee with the man who'd destroyed her world, to trust her life to the very person who'd taken everything from her, it was madness. But as she looked at his face, she saw something there that hadn't been present 3 years ago. Desperation, yes, but also a kind of desperate honesty that cut through all pretense and calculation. "Why?" she asked. "Why would you sacrifice everything for me, for my family?" "Because I finally understand what I've become, what I've been doing in the king's name, and because I'd rather die as the man I should have been than live as the man I've been. It would mean giving up everything, your position, your wealth, your reputation. My reputation is built on ashes and bones. My wealth is paid for in blood and tears. My position requires me to become something I can no longer bear to be." Svala looked down at the royal summons, at the orders that would force Hroar to choose between completing her family's destruction and destroying himself. When she looked up again, something had changed in her expression. Not forgiveness, not yet, but perhaps the beginning of something that might someday become it. "If we run," she said quietly, "there will be no going back. I know. We'll be hunted. The king has a long reach and a longer memory. I know that too, and I still can't promise to forgive you. I may never be able to forgive you. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm asking for the chance to become worthy of it." The silence stretched between them, filled with the weight of choices that would echo through whatever remained of their lives. Outside, Magnus was calling for his captains, beginning preparations for an expedition that might never happen. The king's trap had been perfectly set, but perhaps, just perhaps, there was still a way to break free of it. "When would we leave?" Svala asked. And with those words, Hroar knew that his old life, the life of conquest and glory and willful blindness, was finally over. The stolen provisions lay hidden beneath a tarpaulin in the old storage shed beyond Magnus's stables. 2 days' worth of dried meat, hard bread, and ale for the journey ahead, supplies Hroar had gathered with the methodical care of a man planning for war. The horse tethered nearby was his own, a sturdy mare named Sleipnir, who'd carried him through countless campaigns. Now she would carry him into exile. Everything depended on timing. Magnus expected him to depart for the royal muster in the morning, and Hroar had played his part perfectly, ordering his gear prepared, studying maps of the coast, discussing strategy with the other captains. No one suspected that his real plan involved sailing in the opposite direction entirely. "The ship is ready," Thorolf reported quietly as he slipped into the shed. The grizzled warrior had served under Hroar for 15 years, and his loyalty ran deeper than mere duty to the crown. Provisions loaded, crew sworn to secrecy. "They think we're conducting a scouting mission along the western coast. And the gold? Hidden in grain sacks, as you ordered. Enough to buy passage to the far islands and establish new identities once we're beyond the king's reach." Hroar nodded, checking the straps on their travel packs one final time. The plan was simple in concept, but deadly in execution. Slip away from Magnus's hall during the night, reach the hidden ship before dawn, and sail west toward the lands beyond the king's authority. Simple, except for the dozen ways it could go wrong. "You're certain about this?" Thorolf asked. "Once we sail, there's no returning. The king will brand us outlaws, and every warrior in the northern lands will be hunting us for the bounty on our heads." "I'm certain." "And the woman? You trust her not to betray us?" Hroar's jaw tightened. The question of trust was complicated where Svala was concerned. She had every reason to hate him, every motivation to see him destroyed. But in the 2 days since they'd made their desperate pact, he'd seen something in her eyes that gave him hope, not forgiveness, but perhaps the possibility of it. "She wants to find her brother more than she wants revenge. As long as our goals align, she'll keep faith with us. Pray you're right, because if she changes her mind, she won't." But even as he spoke, Hroar felt the cold touch of uncertainty. They were betting everything on the word of a woman whose life he'd destroyed, whose family he'd scattered to the winds. It was either the height of redemption or the depth of folly, and he wouldn't know which until it was far too late. The sound of approaching footsteps made both men tense, hands moving instinctively toward their weapons. But it was only Svala, moving through the darkness with the careful grace of someone accustomed to avoiding attention. She wore a traveling cloak over her roughest clothes, and her few possessions were bundled in a cloth sack slung over her shoulder. "Is everything ready?" she asked, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what they were attempting. "Ready as it can be," Hroar replied. "Are you sure about this? Once we leave Magnus's protection, you'll be as much an outlaw as I am. There will be no safety, no certainty of survival. There's no safety here either. Gunnar grows bolder each day, and Magnus grows more suspicious of your behavior. How long before he decides that keeping me around is more trouble than it's worth?" She was right, and they all knew it. The political situation had grown increasingly unstable since the royal summons arrived. Gunnar's whispered accusations had found fertile ground among warriors already jealous of Hroar's reputation and confused by his recent changes in behavior. It was only a matter of time before suspicion hardened into action. "Runa?" Hroar asked. "I told her what we planned. She understands why I have to go." Svala's voice caught slightly. "She's the closest thing to a mother I've had these past 3 years. Leaving her behind. We could take her with us." "No. She's too old for such a journey, and Magnus would notice her absence immediately. Better that she remains here, safe in the role she's played for so many years." Thorolf checked the position of the moon through the shed's small window. "We need to move soon. The tide turns in 2 hours, and we'll need that time to reach the ship and clear the harbour mouth." "What about guards?" Svala asked. Magnus posts sentries at the main gates, but they're watching for threats coming in, not for guests leaving. The path to the harbour runs through the old orchard, overgrown and rarely patrolled. Hroar shouldered his pack, the weight familiar from years of campaign. Once we reach the ship, we're committed. No turning back. I understand. But as they prepared to leave the shed, the quiet night exploded into chaos. Shouting voices erupted from the direction of the main hall, followed by the ring of steel on steel and the harsh blast of a war horn. Orange light flickered against the windows, torches or fires being lit throughout the compound. "Gods curse it," Thorolf breathed. "What's happening?" Hroar's mind raced through possibilities, each more dangerous than the last. Discovery of their plan seemed most likely, but the scale of the commotion suggested something larger. Through the noise and confusion, one voice rose above the rest, Gunnar's, shouting orders with the authority of command. "Stay here," Hroar ordered, moving toward the shed's door. "I'll see what—" The door burst open before he could reach it, revealing Gunnar himself, flanked by 4 armed warriors. The red-bearded man's face was flushed with triumph and ale, and his sword was already in his hand. "Well, well, what have we here?" The great Ironhand, skulking in storage sheds with stolen supplies and runaway thralls. Planning a journey, were we? Perhaps somewhere that's not on the king's approved list of destinations? Get out of my way, Gunnar. I think not. You see, I've had a revelation tonight, a sudden understanding of what's been happening under Magnus's very nose. His smile was ugly with satisfaction. It seems our honoured guest has been playing a very different game than anyone suspected. One of the warriors behind Gunnar stepped forward, Leif the Young, barely past his first campaign, but eager to prove himself. "We found messages," he said, his voice tight with nervous excitement. "Hidden correspondence about ship movements, supply purchases, gold transfers, everything needed to plan a secret departure." Hroar's blood turned to ice. He'd been careful about the messages, using trusted intermediaries and coded language, but apparently not careful enough. "Whose orders?" he asked quietly. "Magnus's," Gunnar replied. "Oh, he was very thorough once I brought my concerns to his attention. Amazing what a careful search can reveal when you know what to look for." The trap had been perfectly laid, Hroar realized. Gunnar had been watching, waiting, gathering evidence until he had enough to spring it at the most damaging moment. Now they were caught like animals in a snare, with nowhere to run and no hope of fighting their way clear. "The Lady Astrid was most helpful as well," Gunnar continued, his tone casual despite the deadly implications of his words. "Apparently, she and the thrall have been having quite illuminating conversations about family history and past grievances. Fascinating stories, really. Who would have thought that our distinguished guest had such personal reasons for his recent charitable impulses?" Svala's face went white. "Astrid, wouldn't she promised?" "Oh, she didn't betray you intentionally. Just mentioned in passing how tragic it was that you'd suffered so much at the hands of raiders. How fortunate that Lord Hroar seemed to understand your pain so deeply. How touching it was to see a great warrior showing such kindness to someone who'd lost family to coastal raids." The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. Astrid's innocent observations, combined with Gunnar's suspicious nature and Magnus's growing concerns about Hroar's behavior, had created a perfect storm of exposure. Their careful plan was in ruins before it had even begun. "Magnus wants to see you," Gunnar said, gesturing with his sword toward the door. "All of you. He has questions about loyalty, about honor, about the proper relationship between champions and the crown they serve. And if I refuse to come quietly, then we'll drag you. The choice is yours, but the outcome is the same either way." Thorolf's hand moved toward his weapon, but Hroar shook his head slightly. Fighting would only get them all killed, and there was still a chance, slim though it might be, that Magnus could be reasoned with. At the very least, they might be able to protect Svala from the worst consequences of their failed escape. "Lead the way," Hroar said quietly. As they walked through the compound toward the main hall, Svala moved close enough to whisper, "I'm sorry. This is my fault. If I hadn't trusted Astrid—" "No." Hroar's voice was firm despite their desperate circumstances. "You trusted someone who seemed kind. That's not a flaw to apologize for. What will happen now?" Hroar looked ahead to where Magnus's hall loomed against the night sky, its windows blazing with torchlight. Inside waited judgment, consequences, and quite possibly death. But as he felt Svala's hand briefly touch his arm, a gesture of solidarity, despite everything he realized that some things were worth the risk. "Now," he said quietly, "we face whatever comes, together." The hall doors opened before them like the mouth of a hungry beast, and they stepped forward to meet their fate. The map to safe haven crumpled in Hroar's fist as Magnus's accusations echoed through the hall. Drawn on precious vellum by Thorolf's own hand, it marked a route through treacherous waters to islands beyond the King's Reach Islands, where they might have found sanctuary if their escape had succeeded. Now it would serve only as evidence of their treason. "Betrayal?" Magnus spat, his weathered face flushed with rage and disappointment. "I welcomed you as an honored guest, trusted you with the hospitality of my hall, and this is how you repay that trust? By plotting to steal away in the night like common thieves?" Hroar stood motionless in the center of the hall, flanked by armed guards, while Magnus paced before the high table like a caged wolf. The map had been found during the search of their abandoned supplies, along with forged travel documents and enough gold to finance a new life far from Viking lands. Each piece of evidence damned them more thoroughly than the last. "You have nothing to say in your defense?" Magnus demanded. "No explanation for why the king's champion would risk everything to flee with a thrall?" "She's not just a thrall," Hroar said quietly. "Her name is Svala Eriksdottir. She was born a Jarl's daughter before my raid destroyed her family and took her freedom." The admission sent shocked murmurs rippling through the assembled warriors. Even those who'd suspected some connection between Hroar and the slave girl hadn't imagined anything so damning. "So you admit it," Gunnar said with savage satisfaction. "You admit to feeling guilt over doing your duty as a warrior. Guilt so strong it's turned you traitor to your own king. I admit to finally understanding the cost of what we do, the price paid by those we conquer." "The price?" Magnus's voice rose to a roar. "The price is paid by the weak to purchase the strength of the strong. That's the way of the world, Ironhand, and it's served us well for countless generations." "It's served us," Hroar agreed. "But what about them? What about the children torn from their homes, the families destroyed, the lives shattered for our profit? When did we decide that their suffering was acceptable payment for our glory? When we chose to be warriors instead of sheep?" Gunnar stepped forward, his hand on his sword hilt. "When we decided to take what we needed rather than beg for scraps from others." "You've gone soft, Ironhand, weak. The king was right to test your loyalty." The mention of the king's involvement confirmed what Hroar had suspected. This trap had been planned from the capital, coordinated with Magnus, and sprung at the perfect moment. His reputation, his years of service, his victories in the king's name, all had been weighed against his recent behavior and found wanting. "What will you tell him?" Hroar asked Magnus. "When you send word of what's happened here, I'll tell him the truth. That his champion has become unreliable, that sentiment has corrupted your judgment, that you're no longer fit to lead men in battle or represent the crown's interests, and the penalty for such failures," Magnus's expression darkened, "death, for you and all who aided your betrayal." The words fell like hammer blows in the sudden silence. Svala, who had remained quiet throughout the confrontation, finally spoke. "He's not a traitor for feeling remorse. He's become human." "Silence!" Gunnar backhanded her across the face, sending her staggering. "Thralls speak when spoken to, not before." The blow ignited something primal in Hroar's chest. His hand moved toward his sword before conscious thought could stop him, and only the spear points of the guards held him back. "Touch her again," he said in a voice like winter wind, "and I'll kill you slowly." "With what? You're disarmed, outnumbered, and surrounded by men who know their duty." Gunnar smiled coldly. "But by all means, make threats. It only proves how far you've fallen. Far enough to see clearly, for the first time in years." "See what? That war is ugly, that conquest has costs. We all know that, fool. We just don't let it paralyze us with guilt." Hroar looked around the hall at faces he'd known for years, warriors who'd fought beside him, shared mead with him, celebrated victories won through steel and blood. Now those same faces showed disgust, disappointment, and contempt. He'd become something they couldn't understand, a killer who'd grown tired of killing. "You're right," he said finally. "I have fallen. From the heights of willful ignorance to the depths of understanding. And I wouldn't climb back up if I could." Magnus shook his head sadly. "Then you've chosen your fate. Guards, secure the prisoners. We'll hold them until the king's representatives arrive to carry out judgment." As rough hands seized his arms, Hroar caught Svala's eye. Blood trickled from her split lip where Gunnar had struck her, but her expression held no defeat. Instead, he saw determination, the same fire that had impressed him 3 years ago in the aftermath of Eriksholm's destruction. "It's not over," she whispered as they were dragged toward the hall's rear chambers. "Isn't it? We're trapped, outnumbered and condemned. How is it not over?" Her smile was sharp as a blade's edge. "Because you taught me something important tonight. Sometimes the greatest victories come from the most desperate situations." Before he could ask what she meant, they were separated, he toward the men's holding chamber, she toward whatever fate Magnus had planned for treacherous thralls. But her words echoed in his mind as the door slammed shut behind him. Perhaps it wasn't over after all. Hroar's silver arm ring lay abandoned on the stone floor of his prison chamber, deliberately discarded as the final symbol of his rejection of the old life. The Jarl's gift that had once marked his status as the king's champion now seemed like a shackle from which he'd finally broken free. Let Magnus find it there, let him understand that some bonds, once severed, could never be reforged. The holding chamber was small and damp, carved from the stone foundations beneath Magnus's hall. A single barred window high on the wall let in enough moonlight to see by, and the sound of running water suggested they were near the stream that fed the settlement's wells. Hroar had been alone with his thoughts for what felt like hours, wondering what fate awaited Svala and whether Thorolf had managed to escape in the chaos. The sound of approaching footsteps made him look up, expecting guards come to drag him before Magnus for further questioning. Instead, he heard the soft scrape of metal on stone, followed by a familiar voice speaking quietly through the door. "Stand back from the entrance, Runa." The old slave woman's voice was barely audible, but her presence filled Hroar with sudden hope. The lock mechanism clicked and groaned, and then the heavy door swung open to reveal not just Runa, but Astrid as well, the young bride's face pale but determined in the flickering torchlight. "How?" Hroar began. Questions later, Runa said briskly, pressing a bundle of clothes and a short sword into his hands. "Magnus's guards are drinking themselves into stupidity, celebrating their great victory. We have, perhaps an hour before someone thinks to check the prisoners. Svala, already free, waiting with fresh horses beyond the north pasture." Astrid's voice shook slightly, but her resolve was clear. "I had to help. When I realized how my innocent words had contributed to this trap, I couldn't let injustice stand." Hroar pulled on the plain tunic and cloak they'd brought, weapons and armor that would let him pass for a common traveler in the darkness. "Magnus will suspect you aided our escape. Let him suspect. I'm Eric's wife now, with rights and protections of my own. And besides," Astrid's young face hardened with unexpected steel, "what we're doing is right. Sometimes that matters more than safety." They moved through the settlement's back passages, like ghosts, using servant corridors and storage chambers that Runa had navigated for decades. The old woman's knowledge of Magnus's hall proved invaluable. She knew which boards creaked, which doors stuck, which routes would take them past the guards unnoticed. "Why are you helping us?" Hroar whispered as they paused in the shadow of the grain storage building. Runa's weathered face was grave in the moonlight. "Because I was young once, and in love, and foolish enough to think that happiness was possible even for people like us. Because Svala deserves a chance at the life that was stolen from her. And because sometimes even thralls can choose to do what's right instead of what's safe." They reached the edge of the settlement without incident, slipping past the drowsy sentries who'd grown careless after years of peaceful service. Beyond the defensive earthworks, the landscape opened into rolling meadows and copses of trees where horses could move quickly and quietly. Svala waited in a grove of birch trees, holding the reins of 3 horses, while Thorolf kept watch from higher ground. Her relief at seeing Hroar was visible even in the dim light, and for a moment they simply looked at each other, 2 people who'd found an impossible connection despite everything that should have kept them apart. "The ship?" Hroar asked. "Still waiting," Thorolf reported. "But not for long. Dawn's coming, and Magnus will have every available man searching for us once he discovers the escape. Then we ride hard and hope the wind favors us." As they prepared to mount, Astrid caught Svala's hand. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "My loose tongue nearly destroyed everything." "You were trying to be kind. That's not something to apologize for." Svala squeezed the younger woman's fingers. "Take care of yourself. Marriage to a Jarl's son brings its own dangers. I'll remember what I've learned here. About courage, about standing up for what's right." The sound of a horn echoing from the settlement made them all freeze. Too early for a normal watch change, too urgent for anything but alarm. Their escape had been discovered. "Go," Runa urged, stepping back as they swung into their saddles. "Ride like the wind itself is chasing you." "Come with us," Svala pleaded one final time. "My place is here, child. Yours is wherever the road leads you." The old woman's smile was sad but peaceful. "Find your brother. Find your happiness. That will be victory enough." They thundered away from Magnus's settlement as shouts erupted behind them and torches began to flicker to life throughout the compound. The pursuit would be organized quickly. Magnus was too good a commander to let them escape easily. But they had darkness on their side, and horses that were fresh, while their enemies would need time to saddle their mounts. The race to the harbor had begun, and with it, their desperate gamble for freedom. The simple wooden wedding band caught the morning light streaming through the window of their small cottage, its surface worn smooth by 6 months of constant wearing. Hroar had carved it himself from driftwood found on the shore of their new home, using skills learned in a gentler time before war had claimed so much of his life. It was rough work compared to the elaborate silver rings he'd once worn, but it meant more than all the royal gifts he'd ever received. "It's beautiful here," Svala said, settling beside him on the wooden bench outside their door. The settlement of New Haven stretched before them, a community of refugees and outcasts who'd found peace in this remote valley beyond the reach of kings and their endless wars. 6 months, half a year since they'd fled Magnus's hall in darkness, sailing west through treacherous seas until they reached these distant shores where the old ways of conquest and domination held no power. Half a year of building something new from the ashes of their old lives. "Hard to believe we made it," Hroar murmured, his arm settling naturally around her shoulders. The gesture still surprised him sometimes, this easy intimacy with a woman whose world he'd once destroyed. But time and shared hardship had worked their own kind of magic, transforming hatred into understanding, guilt into purpose. "The letter came yesterday," Svala said quietly, pulling a piece of parchment from her apron pocket. "From the mainland." Thorolf's contacts brought news. Hroar tensed, knowing what the letter must contain. They'd been waiting months for word from the east, for news that would either bring them peace or shatter the fragile happiness they'd built. "Bjorn?" he asked. "Alive?" Her voice broke on the word. 3 years of grief and hope finally resolved. "More than alive, he's thriving. Uncle Einar found him 2 winters ago, ransomed him from his captor with silver and promises. He's learning to be a leader, helping rebuild what the raids destroyed. And he knows about us, about what we've become." Svala nodded, wiping away tears that held more joy than sorrow. "Einar sent word of our flight, our new life together. Bjorn wants to see me, but he understands why we can't return. The price on our heads is too high, and Magnus's men still search the coasts for signs of the traitor Ironhand and his thrall companion." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the daily rhythm of their adopted community. New Haven was small, barely 200 souls, but it grew stronger each year as more refugees found their way to this sanctuary. Former warriors who'd grown tired of endless violence, slaves who'd bought or won their freedom, craftsmen seeking places where their skills mattered more than their past allegiances. "Do you regret it?" Svala asked. "Everything you gave up to come here?" Hroar considered the question seriously. His old life had brought him fame, wealth, and the respect of powerful men. Here, he was simply Hroar the carpenter, known for his skill with wood and his gentle way with the settlement's children. No songs would be sung of his new life. No warriors would toast his name in distant halls. "No," he said finally. "I regret what it took to bring us here, the years of blindness that preceded understanding. But this," he gestured at their simple cottage, their peaceful valley, their quiet life together. "This is the first thing I've done in years that I'm truly proud of." The sound of children's laughter made them both look up. A group of young ones from the settlement came running up the path, their faces bright with excitement. "Hroar! Svala!" called Marta, a girl whose family had fled the southern wars. "Will you tell us the story again, about the warrior and the thrall who sailed beyond the sunset?" Svala smiled, gathering the children around their bench. Over the months, their tale had become legend in New Haven, a story of redemption and transformation that gave hope to others seeking to escape their own dark histories. "Once upon a time," she began, her voice taking on the cadence of ancient storytellers, "there was a warrior who forgot that his enemies were human, and a woman who learned that even the darkest hearts could find light again." As she spoke, weaving their real story into the safe framework of legend, Hroar found himself thinking about the journey that had brought them here. The pain hadn't disappeared, the guilt over past actions, the grief for lost families, the knowledge of suffering caused and endured. But those burdens had been transformed into something useful: wisdom, compassion, and a determination to build rather than destroy. The wooden wedding band caught the light again as he reached for Svala's hand, and he marveled at how something so simple could represent such profound change. They'd found their way from darkness into light, from hatred into love, from the ashes of the old world into the promise of something new. When the story was finished and the children had scattered back to their games, Svala leaned against his shoulder. "Do you think we'll ever stop looking over the horizon?" she asked, wondering if Magnus's ships will appear or the king's justice will find us here. "Perhaps not, but fear of the past doesn't have to rule our future." He touched the wedding ring on her finger, remembering the day he'd placed it there, a simple ceremony witnessed by their new community, blessing a union that would have been impossible in their old lives. "We've built something good here, something worth protecting. Whatever comes, we'll face it together." The sun climbed higher over their valley, warming the earth and promising another day of peace in their hard-won sanctuary. They'd travelled far from the halls of warriors and kings, farther still from the people they'd once been. But sometimes the longest journeys led to the most precious destinations. In the distance, a ship appeared on the horizon, but it flew the peaceful banner of traders, not the war flags of their enemies. New Haven was safe for another day, and that was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.